forces, people being delivered with their P45s in the front line, to debate these issues in a proper and sensible way, and I would challenge them to do that in future.
Thank you, Minister. The phone going off was a cue that your time is up, but can members please make sure that all their phones are off in the chamber? Before we move to the next item of business, members will wish to join me in welcoming to the gallery His Excellency Mr Konstantinos Bikas, the Ambassador of the Hellenic Republic to the United Kingdom. Thank you. We move to First Minister's questions. Question number 1, Johann Lamont.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what engagements he has planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
Engagements to take forward the Government's programme for Scotland.
Johann Lamont.
Thank you very much. Will the First Minister join with me in condemning the Tories' top-rate tax cut for millionaires, or does he agree with George Osborne? First
Minister.
No, I'll join with Johann Lamont in condemning that. Not only do I join in condemning that, I point out that the SNP led the opposition in the House of Commons to voting against it. I tend to agree with the points now made by the Shadow Chancellor that when the deficit is high, it is unfair to have a burden on the ordinary people of this country, and that burden not to be shared by those who are better off. Hence, we followed that logic in our votes in the House of Commons.
Johann Lamont.
Thank you. So, will the First Minister back Labour's policy of reintroducing the 50p tax rate now or after a yes vote?
First Minister.
Well, I look forward to a vote in the House of Commons, which I'm confident will come later this month in the budget, and I'm also confident about how the SNP will vote on that. Perhaps Johann Lamont would give us some assurance that that's what the Labour Party will do. As she'll remember, on the 27th of March 2012, when the SNP moved against us in the House of Commons, only 2 Labour MPs, Dennis Skinner and Paul Flynn, actually voted against the reduction of the top-rate tax. Now, there were a number of explanations as to why that happened. Willie Bain tweeted that Labour don't support the vote on partisan grounds because it was a convention. They don't support SNP motions. Luckily for Johann Lamont, if it's the Labour Party who move against it later this month, we have no such bar. We'll judge the issue in what is right and proper, and we think it's wrong at this time, when the deficit's high, to ask ordinary people to bear burdens and them not to be shared by those who are better off. I'm sure with her influence over our Westminster colleagues, she'll manage to bring them into line on tax matters.
Johann Lamont.
Of course, we've developed an interesting convention in here that we don't answer the question we were asked. Because in all of that, I don't think we got an affirmation that the First Minister will back Labour's policy of reintroducing the 50p tax rate after a yes vote. And indeed, in Monday of this week, he said, we are certainly not going to put ourselves at tax disadvantage with the rest of the United Kingdom. Saying one thing in one place, saying absolutely nothing in here. We look forward to hearing the answer to the question I asked him. Does Deputy First Minister is keen to say it's quite simple, yes or no. Because there is something curious here. The First Minister says we should vote for independence to get away from the Tories' destructive policies, yet he is committing an independent Scotland to the same tax rates the Tories set. Apart from, well, he was on Monday, so apart from, he was on Monday, unless he's recanting that position, apart from those taxes, of course, like corporation tax, which he wants to cut even further than anything George Osborne says. Isn't it the case that the First Minister's vision of an independent Scotland won't get rid of the Tories? It will enshrine a tougher tax-cutting agenda than even the Tories have come up with.
First Minister.
My first answer, I pointed out that I agreed with Ed Balls, the Shadow Chancellor, when he changed Labour's policy on the 25th of January this year, that when the deficit is still high, it can't be right to have tax cuts for the richest people in the country. I think that is the right policy. Not only do I think it now, we thought it in 2012 when we led the opposition to it in the House of Commons. Now, I wasn't going to pursue this, but since Johann Lamont has offered me the opportunity, perhaps I'll do it. As I said, there were a number of explanations why Labour didn't support the SNP motion. Ed Ball's political adviser, Alec Bellardenelli, admitting to, well, it's unmentionable, but a something up somewhere along the way last night, said it wasn't clear that the SNP called a vote, and so we abstained in a vote. Then there was Alan Gillam, the political adviser to Margaret Curran, who emails Labour's Holyrood media team on the 27th of March 2012 saying, "I'm trying to find out where we went wrong." In an earlier email, he hoped the Scottish media would just ignore it. And we should probably hold off releasing line in Scotland just yet in the hope that it is ignored. Well, thankfully, thanks to Johann Lamont, she's given me the opportunity to draw it to people's attention. So, in 2012, we thought the tax cut for the richest people in the country in current circumstances was wrong, so we voted against it. We think it's wrong now, so we're voting against it. And in a vote I expect in the House of Commons later this month, we'll vote against it yet again. I agree that in current circumstances, a deficit, to quote Ed Balls directly, it is wrong to reduce the top-rate tax on those who are better off in this country. It is unfair, and I would suggest to Johann Lamont we seem to have followed that policy rather more consistently than she and her colleagues have managed to do over these last 2 years.
Johann Lamont.
So we know what you'll do now, but we don't know what you'll do in an independent Scotland. No surprise there. Because what he appears to be saying is the tax policies of the Tories restrict growth now, and I agree with him, but somehow the same policies in an independent Scotland create growth. This is simply not credible, and he owes it to people to whom he is saying that he is offering an alternative to the Tories to follow through and answer the simple question I asked him: whether he supports Labour's policy of reintroducing the 50p tax rate after a yes vote. No answer from the First Minister, nothing new there. Because in 7 years, the truth is, we have not seen a single policy from Alex Salmond which has redistributed wealth from rich to poor. He talks of being a progressive beacon, but it turns out is a beacon he never lit. And now the First Minister had committed himself to tax levels set by a Tory government in what he will have made a foreign country. In the 70s, we used to call the SNP the tartan Tories. Isn't it the case? Isn't it the case? A First Minister who couldn't answer a simple question on taxation, that he might still be tartan, but he is committing himself to out-Tory the Tories on tax in an independent Scotland.
First Minister. Order.
I think the answer is no on all counts to Johann Lamont's questions. Can I just point out the history of this? Labour were in power for 13 years. Oh yes, we're going to hear the history.
Order.
Labour were in power for 13 years at Westminster. They had the 50p rate, top tax rate for 36 days of that entire 13 years in power. 36 days out of 13 years. Ed Balls has brought forward the entirely sensible position, in my view, that while the deficit is high, it is unfair to ask the lower paid and people on average earnings to accept the burden. And under these circumstances, you should not have the cut in top rate tax. John Swinney set out the position of the SNP very clearly indeed last month in detail, both what we have done and what we are going to do and the circumstances of an independent Scotland. He also pointed out, under the current position of this Parliament, we don't have the power to set taxation. Under the position proposed that's coming, we still don't have the power to vary top-rate taxation. In an independent Scotland, we'll have the ability not just to vary top-rate taxation, but all taxation. And yes, we'll do it to benefit the people of Scotland and to benefit the Scottish economy. And of course, we'll also introduce policies like the transformation of childcare, like free school meals across the country, and we'll do it against Labour Party opposition, no doubt, but we'll do it because we are committed to a fairer and better society in Scotland.
Question number 2. Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister when he'll next meet the Secretary of State for Scotland.
First Minister.
No plans near future.
Ruth Davidson.
Thank you. In 2007, when the First Minister came to office, there were 386 operational police stations in Scotland. Can I ask the First Minister, how many of these stations have now closed to the public under his watch?
Well, I'll certainly write to Ruth Davidson with that figure, but what I can tell her absolutely that there are now 1,000 more police officers in the streets and communities around Scotland. I think that's a substantial achievement and the fact and the figure that people in Scotland rally towards.
Ruth Davidson.
It was a perfectly simple question, and I don't need to wait for a letter, because as of Monday, when a whole raft of front desks were shut, the answer is 233. That's 233 police stations out of 386. 60% of Scotland's police stations closed to the public or closed altogether under this SNP government, and that is a disgrace. And on top of this, Presiding Officer, a fifth of Scotland's sheriff courts shut, half of police control rooms for the Axe with Dumfries First next month, and a shambolic approach to corroboration and the law of evidence. The Justice Secretary has claimed that any opposition to change is a unionist conspiracy, but the voice of reason, sadly absent from the chamber today, Joan McAlpine, in an SNP press release that I have here said, and I quote, "The move to a single force, reductions in public access counters, and now the proposed removal of the police control room create a risk that a service that was once very close to the community is becoming distant from them." There we have the First Minister's own adviser warning that the SNP's policies are taking justice further from the people of Scotland. Even Joan McAlpine recognises that there is a problem here. When will the Justice Secretary and when will the First Minister?
First Minister.
Well, I don't share Ruth Davidson's analysis of this for a range of reasons. As she well knows, under current circumstances, the budget we have for justice, for the police and for virtually every other spending department in this country is controlled by what is spent at Westminster. As she also knows, there have been dramatic declines in the justice budget and in police numbers of 10% in England and Wales over the last few years. Despite that situation, we've managed in Scotland to not just maintain but to increase police numbers. Now, that is not something that's happening or being centralised. That's something that's happening across the country. We have, for the figures up to Q1 2013 compared to Q1 2007, in Strathclyde, police numbers were up 8%, in Dumfries and Galloway 6%, Grampian 10%, Tayside 8%, Northern Constabulary up 12%, Central Region up 6%, Fife up 5%, and the rest up 7% in Lothian and Borders. Now, that shows that this increase in police numbers is not being concentrated in a few areas, but taking place around the country, which brings me to my second difference. I think what the figures on recorded crime demonstrate, the extraordinary success of more than a generation decrease in recorded crime, that what matters is not where the backup office is in terms of police and effectiveness in communities, it's where the frontline officers are. It's not the number of chief constables you have or deputy chief constables, it's where the frontline officers are. And no reasonable person looking at the situation in Scotland compared to the situation in England and Wales would come to any other conclusion that the decrease in recorded crime figures in Scotland totally vindicate our 1,000 increase in police numbers in communities the length and breadth of this country.
Question number 3, Willie Rennie.
To ask the First Minister what issues will be discussed at the next meeting of the Cabinet.
First Minister.
Issues are of importance to the people of Scotland.
Willie Rennie.
Last week, the Justice Secretary let this Parliament down. He dismissed critics of his plan to abolish corroboration as a unionist cabal who did not care about victims. Look at who he picked on. John Finney is no unionist. Rhoda Grant stands up for victims every day of the week. And Christine Graham is a proud member of the SNP. I know that deep down the First Minister was not proud of his Justice Secretary. So will he take this opportunity now to put things right by taking corroboration out of the bill? First Minister.
No, I don't think that would be the right way forward. And the reason I don't think it's the right way forward, and let me quote Sandy Brindley, the National Coordinator of Rape Crisis Scotland. We are delighted that the vote went in favour of the removal of the requirement for corroboration in this landmark debate. It's a step forward ensuring our justice system is able to deliver effective justice for all. All too often, victims of sexual violence and domestic abuse see their cases fail at the first hurdle, given the burden of proof required by corroboration. Removing this barrier and looking instead at the quality of evidence in the case is common sense, and why every other justice system in the world has abandoned this rule. Now, in organisations which represent the victims of crime, I think Willie Rennie would agree there is substantial support for the moves being made by the Justice Secretary, so that justice can be seen to be done for the victims of crime. If, as the Justice Secretary has proposed, with the review group under Lord Bonamy, we can make sure in doing that there are safeguards to prevent miscarriages of justice, then surely that is the right conclusion to get to. That's a conclusion which both safeguards against miscarriage of justice and also represents the victims of crime. I know that Willie Rennie doesn't feel that people should be denied justice, but does he not at least accept that a general rule of corroboration for many cases, which were listed before the committee, results in the denial of justice to some victims of some of the worst crimes we can possibly have in our society? That would tend to indicate that the direction of travel that this government is taking is the right one.
Willie Rennie.
But there are so many others who disagree with him. He once said in this Parliament he had a majority, but he did not have a monopoly on wisdom. And there's little wisdom in the Justice Department just now. Chaos on police centralisation with a Strathclyde takeover, police stations shutting and control rooms closing. Misjudged sectarianism bill. Court closures. Levels of stop and search that the Met in London would reject as extreme. And now corroboration. He's had to hire 17 experts to fix the damage he's about to cause on corroboration. And today, in the papers, there's more news about people angry at the divisive and tarnished behaviour. Is he really proud of the work of the Justice Secretary on this bill? First Minister.
I think Willie Rennie rather ruined his case. I mean, I tried to answer his first question looking at the substance of the argument. Now he's come forward with a second question after denouncing party politics in his first question, which seems to me entirely party political and partisan in the points that he's made. Well, people can judge the record. That didn't seem to me to represent that pinnacle of consensus that Willie Rennie had been working towards in previous questions. So let me try and answer again on the substance of the issue. The substance of the issue is that there is injustice. Injustice can be perpetuated in a system in two ways. One, miscarriage of justice, which nobody wants, and everybody wants to see safeguards in a system to make sure that doesn't happen and that is limited in its happening. But secondly, people being denied justice. And we've had case after case which cannot be brought to court because of the general rule of evidence, of corroboration. That is to say, judging cases on the quantity of evidence as opposed to the quality of evidence. And therefore, with the safeguards that the Justice Secretary has put forward in the safeguards review under Lord Bonamy, that seems a very reasonable way to proceed. And now, I think I will allow myself, since Willie Rennie offered me the opportunity, let's say we were contrasting two justice systems. Let's say we were contrasting a justice system where there is a fundamental fissure and division between the police service and the government, a lack of confidence on both sides, and a justice system where both the police and the government and the justice system are working effectively in order to reduce levels of recorded crime. The first description is a description of what's happening in England at the present moment, where his party are jointly in power. The second description, with more police and less crime, is what's happening in Scotland. So yes, indeed, I have every confidence in the pursuit of justice in Scotland.
Question number 4, Linda Fabiani.
To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government is doing to encourage more women to start their own businesses.
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, with your permission, can I begin by reflecting on what I'm sure will be sadness for the whole Chamber at the news this morning that Ailsa Mackay, the Professor of Economics at Glasgow Caledonian University, has passed away. Ailsa, as we all know, was a leading voice in the campaign for gender equality, not simply through her work, but as a founding member of the Scottish Women's Budget Group. In this week, as we go forward to International Women's Day above all, I think it's important that we note her astonishing contribution as a feminist economist, both in arguing the case for women into work, but also being the principal author and arguer for, over many years, for transformation of childcare, which will make that possible. I do hope and believe, and I know that Ailsa's contribution will be recognised by every member of this chamber.
Yes, we know that Ailsa will be sorely missed. Can I ask the First Minister to set out the increased opportunities that independence will offer to increase business start-ups by women and to improve childcare for households in Scotland to encourage this?
Linda Fabiani should forgive me. I should have answered specifically about the number of women running their own business, which has grown from 81,900 in 2009 to 93,700 in 2013, which is an increase of 14%. It's also the case there's been some substantial success in an increase of 70,000 of women in employment in Scotland over the last year. In fact, the number of women in employment in Scotland is now a record high. I think it is important that everyone understands that policies that we pursue for Scotland should pass what I describe as the childcare test. That is to say, the sustainability of the policy, like the transformation in childcare which we propose, it needs to be sustained by the government not just bearing the costs of that policy, an important cost which must be met because of the crucial nature of the policy, but also the benefits. That is, the increase in taxation that comes from having more women move into the workforce. So the childcare policy is one which is justified not just by the benefits to children, which are substantial, not just by the emancipation of women into the workforce, but as a policy which can lead to more sustainable economic growth and fundamental equality in Scotland.
Question 5, Neil Findlay.
To ask the First Minister when the waiting time standard of 98% of patients being seen and admitted, transferred or discharged from accident and emergency departments within 4 hours was last met across the whole country.
Minister.
The 98% 4-hour accident emergency performance level, that's to be treated, admitted, transferred or discharged, was set by the previous administration in 2004 and was never met by that administration. An ISD sample survey for April 2006 showed performance at 87.6%. ISD statistics show that the standard of 98% was first exceeded in May 2008 and last exceeded in September 2009. I'm pleased to say through the £50 million 3-year unscheduled care action plan, the NHS will be reshaping and enhancing service to make sure that these standards can be met sustainably in the future.
Neil Findlay.
I think what the First Minister meant to say, and I'm sure it just slipped his mind, is that the A&E waiting time figures are worse than 2007, and that the last time the standard was met across Scotland was almost 4.5 years ago. People are waiting longer, staff are struggling to cope because of the intense and growing pressures on A&E. So just for once, can we get a clear answer from the First Minister? Does he think this is acceptable, and when will he finally keep his promise to staff and patients on A&E waiting times?
First Minister.
Can I just repeat to Neil Findlay
Order.
It was so obvious to get on to supplementary of what I said. The ISD sample survey for 2006 showed performance at 87.6%. ISD statistics show that the standard of 98% was first exceeded in May 2008 and last exceeded in September 2009. So what on earth was his second question about? Everything he asked for his second question, it was said by my first answer. Well, we can do a bit of pantomime here. Yes, it most certainly was. Now, the pertinent statistic, of course, which Neil Findlay tried to slide over, is we did have a test in the last administration. Not only was the figure 87.6%, but Andy Kerr hailed the performance. He said, "This is the first time we've had comprehensive data. This data shows that the vast majority of A&E departments are meeting the 4-hour target. Investment and reform in the NHS is paying off." Now, that was Andy Kerr, then the Health Minister, hailing a performance of 87.5%. So I agree with Neil Findlay. I agree with the Health Secretary. The investment that's going in and the unscheduled care campaign is enabling us to resist the winter pressures far better than, for example, last year. But how on earth can the Labour Party come along here and complain about statistics which are infinitely better than the statistics they hailed when they were in office?
Question number 6, Liz Smith.
To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's position is on the calls from Transform Scotland to upgrade the rail network.
First Minister.
Well, the £5 billion package of funding and investment for our railways in 2019, which per head of population is twice that of the UK Government, will support improvements to infrastructure and services across the network, benefiting both freight and passengers alike. This investment enables substantial improvements, for example, to the Highland Main Line and to the Aberdeen to Inverness line, including improvements on the route between Aberdeen and Inverness, which aims to deliver an hourly service, 2-hour journey time, enhance commuter services to both cities, and enable new stations at Kintore in Aberdeenshire and in Dalcross, of course, near Inverness Airport.
Liz Smith.
Could I thank the First Minister for that? I think everybody welcomes the changes to the infrastructure. However, could I ask the First Minister about the pledge that he made in August 2008 when he said that the Scottish Government would reduce the journey time on the Edinburgh-Inverness rail route by 35 minutes by 2012. 2 years on, when will that pledge be met?
First Minister.
The investment profile for Inverness and Aberdeen, I've just read out to Liz Smith. But I'm glad she welcomes what is being done, because there is substantial improvement. I mean, for example, 33% rise in passenger numbers, 26.5 miles of new railway line, an investment programme that's twice that of the UK Government. I know that Liz Smith, in her normal cheery way, will see that as progress, and I undertake to see that progress continue in the rail network in Scotland.
John Mason.
First Minister, part of Transform Scotland's proposals is to implement a direct link between Perth and Edinburgh at a cost of approximately £500 million. That might well have a knock-on effect on existing rail services in Central and Eastern Fife. Does he share my concern that any proposals should take full consideration of the impact they would have on existing services?
First Minister.
Well, I think we all welcome the ambition of Transform Scotland and many of the proposals they make, but I think it's quite important to highlight the need for promoters of change to approach the relevant regional transport partnerships to discuss the potential impact of proposals on local areas and the requirements to develop an up-to-date feasibility study which examines all transport modes. And that certainly the member's right to point out. You should assess the impact of communities on the Edinburgh to Perth corridor as improvements are proposed. These are, if you look at the statistics, exciting times for the railways in Scotland. There are laudable ambitions to make even greater progress. We should recognise the progress that has been made, but we should also consider carefully the implications of any proposals to make sure it does not result in a deterioration of the service elsewhere.
Alice McInnes.
Presiding Officer, on top of the current £650 million being spent on the Edinburgh-Glasgow Rail Improvement Project, the First Minister's Government now proposes to build a high-speed rail line between Edinburgh and Glasgow by 2024. In contrast, the scale of the First Minister's ambition for his own constituents is to offer them a meagre 20-minute reduction in train journeys between Edinburgh and Aberdeen by 2030. When is the First Minister going to stop shortchanging the North East?
First Minister.
Well, unfortunately for Alison McKenna, she should have changed her question after she heard my answer to Liz Smithy's first question, which was all about the enhanced improvements to the Aberdeen-Inverness line, which I can assure her are of great concern to my constituents, and they're looking forward indeed to the new stations at Kintoa and indeed, I'm sure, further north at Dalcross as well. And given, of course, the concentration of the transport budgets, in my view rightly so, over the next planning period in terms of the peripheral route round Aberdeen and the dualling of the A9, not promised incidentally by any previous administration, including the ones that the Liberals have been involved in, does she not recognise that one of the great things that's happening is to see these transport improvements across Scotland? And I'm sure she didn't want in any way to attack and criticise, maybe the Liberals have not got much to lose in the Edinburgh-Glasgow corridor, but the important developments in electrification that are taking place in Edinburgh to Glasgow. And if I could just add one final point, that when the Liberals, through the arithmetic of this chamber, had a decisive role in deciding where the transport budget should be allocated, I seem to remember they played an absolute decisive role in deciding that the trams project in Edinburgh should be put above. Now, of course, thanks to the intervention of Transport Scotland and the good work of the new administration in Edinburgh Council, the trams are back on track. But I think most people in Scotland might have judged that back in 2007-2008, Alison McInnes should have listened to wiser counsel and perhaps given more that is now being invested in the A9 and the peripheral route round Aberdeen.
Lewis MacDonald.
Thank you very much. Does the First Minister agree with Transform Scotland that the journey times between Aberdeen and the Central Belt would be greatly improved by double-tracking the one short stretch of single track on the East Coast Main Line at Montrose? And if he does agree with them, is that something the Scottish Government is prepared to consider?
First Minister.
Well, it's most certainly something that the Scottish Government is prepared to consider. I do think that the dual tracking, both in terms of the Aberdeen line and in terms of the Inverness line as well, offers substantial improvements to journey time. That's something that Keith Brown will actively take forward if the member would like to arrange a meeting. He can hear our thinking about that in person. But I know that Lewis MacDonald will want to welcome indeed the improvements in the Aberdeen-Inverness line, which I spelt out in my first answer, because his constituents and mine are very pleased indeed to hear about these improvements.
That ends First Minister's questions. We move to members' business. Members who are leaving the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.